He was supposed to be the one who had it all figured out. Every other athlete in history carried a fatal flaw, a weakness that eventually found them, a crack that eventually swallowed them. But LeBron James spent 20 years convincing the world that he was different, that he had read the blueprint, studied the cautionary tales, and built something so airtight, so deliberate, so layered with love and loyalty and calculated greatness that the thing which breaks every other man simply would not reach him. And then, on a July morning in 2023, his 18-year-old son collapsed on a basketball court and stopped breathing. And everything LeBron James had spent his entire life building, the armor, the brand, the careful mythology of control, cracked open in a way no championship ring and no MVP trophy and no billion-dollar empire could repair. Because the man who had carried the weight of an entire city, an entire generation, an entire cultural conversation about Black excellence and American ambition, could not carry his son off that court. He could only wait. Like every other father in history who has ever stood in a hospital corridor and felt the full, terrifying smallness of a human being in the face of something they cannot fix. This is not a story about basketball. This is a story about what it costs to be chosen before you are ready. About what happens to a boy who carries the weight of a world he never asked to hold. About the particular cruelty of building a life so visible that every crack becomes a spectacle and every fear becomes a headline. About a man who gave the world everything it asked for, and then sat alone in the dark, wondering what was left for him. Before we reach that hospital, before we reach the championship stages and the billboards and the billion-dollar empire, we need to go back to a city that the rest of America had already given up on. Back to a building with no heat and no reliable food. Back to a boy who had every reason in the world to disappear, and refused. LeBron Raymond James was born on December 30th, 1984 in Akron, Ohio. Not the Akron of rubber industry prosperity or Midwestern promise. The Akron that remained after the factories closed and the jobs left and the neighborhoods that had once held working families together began, block by block, to come apart. Gloria James was 16 years old when LeBron was born. 16. Her mother, Freda, the woman who was the household's true anchor, died 2 years later. And overnight, a teenager with a 2-year-old son lost the one person who made survival feel possible. What followed was not poverty in the abstract. It was poverty in the specific, grinding daily sense. Eviction notices. Apartments that lasted months before the rent fell through. Weeks spent with friends, with relatives, with anyone who had a floor and didn't ask too many questions. Gloria moved them 8 times in 1 year. 8 times in 12 months, a child learning that nothing was permanent. That the place you called home could become unavailable before the month was out. That the only constant was her, exhausted, young, refusing to surrender, dragging him forward into a life she was building in real time with no map and no safety net. LeBron has spoken about this period carefully over the years. Not with bitterness, with something closer to awe. My mom kept me off the streets, he has said more than once. She sacrificed everything. But the word sacrifice carries a weight that press conferences cannot fully hold. Because what Gloria James sacrificed was not just comfort or stability. She sacrificed the ordinary assumption that tomorrow would look like today. She sacrificed the right to feel settled, the quiet dignity of a fixed address, the kind of groundedness that most people never notice until it disappears. What does it do to a child, growing up inside that kind of uncertainty? Think about that for a moment. Have you ever had to build your identity in a place that kept shifting beneath your feet? Leave a comment below, because that question is at the center of everything LeBron James became. In 4th grade, LeBron missed 83 days of school. 83 days. Not from illness, not from indifference, from the chaos of a life that had not yet found its footing. His teachers were worried. His classmates barely knew him. And a boy who might have simply vanished into the statistics of Akron's forgotten neighborhoods might have done exactly that, if not for a man named Frank Walker. Frank Walker was a youth football coach in Akron. He saw LeBron playing in the street, saw something in the way the boy moved, and made an offer to Gloria that changed the course of both their lives. He would take LeBron in. Not permanently, not formally, just enough to give him structure, consistency, a household with rules and routines, and the quiet, radical stability of knowing where he would sleep 2 nights in a row. Gloria said yes. And LeBron James, at 9 years old, went to live with another family and stopped missing school. The structure opened something in him that the chaos had been holding shut. He absorbed everything. He was brilliant in the way that children who have had to pay attention to survive are always brilliant. Observant, adaptive, alert to every signal in a room. And when he discovered basketball, really discovered it, not just as a game but as a language, something in him recognized that he had found the thing that would carry him out. He grew fast. He understood the game faster. By the time he reached St. Vincent St. Mary High School in Akron, the whispers had already started. But whispers were not the right word. By his sophomore year, LeBron James was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. By his junior year, his high school games were being broadcast on national television. By his senior year, scouts and executives and basketball philosophers from every corner of the world had arrived in Akron, Ohio, to watch a 17-year-old play a game and confirm what everyone had already decided. He was the chosen one. It is a title that sounds like a blessing. In the hands of a 17-year-old boy from a broken building in Akron, it was also something else. A weight. A burden so enormous it required an entire identity to support. And LeBron James, with the particular genius that had always been his most underappreciated gift, began to build that identity immediately. He studied Michael Jordan. He studied Magic Johnson. He studied Kobe Bryant. He studied not just their games but their architectures, the way they managed their public presence, the way they controlled their narratives, the way they balanced the performance of invincibility with the reality of human limitation. And he assembled from those studies a version of himself so deliberate, so carefully constructed, that even those closest to him sometimes struggled to find the seam between the man and the monument. In 2003, the Cleveland Cavaliers selected him first overall in the NBA draft. He was 18 years old, had never played a professional game, and was already expected to save a franchise, resurrect a city, and justify a mythology that had been building for 4 years. He walked into that building and smiled for the cameras and looked, by every visible measure, completely unafraid. He was afraid. Of course he was. But LeBron James had been afraid before. He had been 9 years old and sleeping in a stranger's house because his mother needed help she was too proud to ask for and too desperate to refuse. He knew how to carry fear. He had been carrying it his whole life. He had simply gotten very good at making it look like something else. What nobody, not the scouts, not the executives, not the television cameras that followed his every movement, what nobody fully understood in those early years was the specific nature of what LeBron James was carrying. Not just the weight of expectation. The weight of being a symbol for a city that had been told, in 100 quiet ways, that it did not deserve good things. Cleveland, Ohio had not won a major professional sports championship since 1964. 40 years of close calls and collapses, and the particular resignation of a fan base that had learned, the hard way, to brace for disappointment. And here was this kid from Akron, their kid, a Northeast Ohio native who had grown up 30 miles from their stadium, who was supposed to change all of that. He was 19 when he scored 25 points in his third NBA game, 20 when he led the Cavaliers to the playoffs for the first time in years, 22 when he carried a broken team almost single-handedly to the NBA Finals, scoring 48 points in a double overtime victory over Detroit, in a performance that old-timers compared to the greatest they had ever seen. The Cavaliers lost the finals that year to the San Antonio Spurs, but no one remembered the Spurs. They remembered the performance. They remembered a boy from Akron who had, for one impossible week, looked like the best basketball player on the planet. He wasn't wrong to believe it, and the world wasn't wrong to believe it either. And then came the summer of 2010, and everything broke. LeBron James became a free agent in the summer of 2010 at 25 years old, 7 years into a career that had made him the most discussed athlete on the planet. He could go anywhere. He could stay. He could dictate his future with a specificity that no player in the history of the sport had ever fully exercised. And he chose to exercise it in a way that no one anticipated, and that no one who witnessed it has ever quite forgiven. The Decision, a 1-hour television special on ESPN, broadcast on July 8, 2010, in which LeBron James announced live to the world that he was leaving Cleveland to join Dwyane Wade and Chris Bosh in Miami. The format was his idea. The intention, his supporters argued, was philanthropy. The proceeds went to the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, and millions of dollars were raised that night for children who needed them. The effect was something entirely different, because in the hours that followed, the residents of Cleveland gathered in the streets and burned his jersey. Dan Gilbert, the Cavaliers owner, published an open letter in Comic Sans font, calling LeBron a traitor and promising his former city that they would win a championship before him. Commentators who had spent years celebrating his genius turned, with remarkable speed, into prosecutors. And LeBron James, who had committed no crime beyond choosing his own employer, became almost overnight the most hated man in American sports. Stop and sit with that for a moment. He was 25 years old. He was a child who had grown up with nothing, who had scratched his way into a position of power that almost no one from his background ever reaches. And he had used that power to make a decision about his own life. And the world responded by burning his face in the street. Have you ever been punished for doing exactly what you had every right to do? Has a decision you made in your own best interest ever cost you something you didn't expect to lose? Tell us below. Because what happened to LeBron James in the summer of 2010 was not just a sports story. It was a story about what America does to black men who step outside the role they have been assigned. The Miami years were, by every statistical and competitive measure, a success. 4 consecutive finals appearances, 2 championships, the individual performances of his career to that point. In 2013, trailing by 3 points with seconds remaining in Game 6 of the NBA Finals, LeBron hit a corner three-pointer that kept the season alive, a shot that, replayed, still carries the particular electricity of something impossible becoming real. He won the championship the following night. But something was wrong. Something that the trophies couldn't fix and the headlines couldn't name. LeBron in Miami was brilliant and correct and productive, and somehow, in a way that resisted easy articulation, diminished. The decision had changed the public's relationship with him in ways that went deeper than opinion. They no longer saw him as theirs. They saw him as a manipulator, a calculator, a man who arranged his own life at the expense of other people's feelings. And LeBron, who had grown up with nothing, who had built his entire identity on the idea that he could be both great and beloved, began to understand for the first time that those two things could come apart. In 2014, he went home. The announcement was simple this time. No television special. An essay in Sports Illustrated, written in his own words, that began, "I'm coming home." He was returning to Cleveland, to the team that had burned his jersey, to the city that had cursed his name, to the place where everything had started and from which he had been, In the eyes of those who loved him most, a traitor. And 2 years later, he delivered. June 19, 2016. Game 7 of the NBA Finals. Cleveland Cavaliers versus Golden State Warriors. The Warriors had won 73 games in the regular season, the most in NBA history. They led the series 3-1. No team in the history of the NBA Finals had ever come back from that deficit. With 1 minute and 50 seconds remaining in the game, LeBron James ran down a Warrior fast break and blocked a layup from behind. A play that exists now in a category beyond sports. A play that belongs to the canon of moments in which a single human being wills something into existence through sheer, terrifying refusal. The Cavaliers won the game, won the series, won the championship, and LeBron James collapsed on the court and wept. Not the composed, photogenic tears of a man performing for a camera. The ugly, heaving, unstoppable tears of a person releasing something that has been building for a very long time. The boy from Akron, the chosen one. The traitor who came home. Lying on the floor of a basketball court in his hometown, crying because the thing he had promised was real. Cleveland, Ohio, had its championship. And for a few weeks, nothing else mattered. But the human body does not care about narratives. It does not pause for moments of completion. And LeBron's body, which he had pushed with a discipline that bordered on the obsessive, the training, the diet, the recovery protocols, the sleep monitoring, the staggering investment in physical maintenance that he estimated publicly at one point at over $1 million a year, was accumulating a debt that no recovery protocol could fully prevent. The mileage was becoming visible. Not in collapse, not yet, but in the subtle recalibration that aging forces even on the most extraordinary physical specimens. He moved a half step slower. He needed more rest days. The high-wire performances of his mid-20s, the nights when he seemed to hover slightly above the limitations of the human form, required more elaborate preparation and left larger deficits behind. He joined the Los Angeles Lakers in 2018. He was 33 years old, still statistically elite, still capable of performances that made analysts reach for language that felt inadequate. But the narrative around him had shifted. The question was no longer whether LeBron was the greatest. It was whether the greatest could hold on long enough to finish what he had started. And underneath that public question was a private one he had been carrying for years. What happens to LeBron James when it is over? He had no template. He had never been a person without basketball. He had been the chosen one at 13. He had been on Sports Illustrated at 16. He had been a professional at 18. Every version of himself that he could remember had existed in relation to the game, to the arena, to the roar of a crowd that told him, every night, that he was real. What was underneath that? He didn't know, and not knowing frightened him in ways that the basketball court never had. Then, July 24th, 2023 arrived. LeBron James's son, Bronny James, was 18 years old and a freshman at the University of Southern California. He had chosen USC partly to keep his options open, and partly, it was understood, to keep himself close to the possibility that his father had been floating publicly for years. The idea of playing in the NBA alongside LeBron. A father and son, on the same team, in the same game. An unprecedented thing. A dream so specific it felt almost presumptuous to say out loud. On that Monday morning, Bronny James was participating in a practice at USC's Galen Center when he collapsed on the court and went into cardiac arrest. The medical staff acted immediately. A defibrillator was used. His heart was restarted. He was rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. And somewhere in Los Angeles, LeBron James received a phone call that rearranged the structure of his entire existence. Think about what that phone call means. Not as a headline, as a reality. A father, a son, a court, A defibrillator, the difference between everything and nothing, measured in seconds. LeBron James, the man who had spent 40 years developing an armor so complete that almost nothing reached through it, the man who had been a symbol and a brand and a movement and an institution, who had turned his personal history into the foundation of an empire, sat in a hospital and felt what every parent who has ever sat in that specific chair has felt. The absolute, unresolvable terror of not being enough. Of being the most powerful person in every room you have ever entered and having no power at all. He did not post. He did not release a statement. The family issued a brief medical update confirming that Bronny was in stable condition and that they would not be sharing further details. And LeBron James disappeared from the noise that had surrounded him for his entire adult life and sat next to his son. What emerged weeks later, in fragments in the careful language of a man processing something he did not yet have words for, was the portrait of a father changed, not broken. LeBron James had never been broken by anything, but altered. Quieter in a way that his previous quietness had never been. More aware of the particular smallness of every achievement that the world had decided was large. His son had almost died. Nothing else was the sentence. Bronny recovered. The diagnosis was a congenital heart defect, a structural abnormality he had been born with, that had waited 18 years to announce itself in the most terrifying possible way. He underwent surgery. He returned to basketball months later, a fact that inspired and frightened in equal measure. And in April 2024, the Los Angeles Lakers selected Bronny James in the second round of the NBA draft, making the James family the first father and son to play simultaneously in the history of the NBA. It should have been the crowning moment, the dream made real. And in some ways it was. The photographs of them standing together in Lakers uniforms carried a weight that transcended basketball. A boy from Akron who grew up with nothing, whose mother moved 8 times in a single year, who was chosen before he was ready and carried it anyway, standing next to his son on the same court. But something in LeBron's face in those photographs, if you look carefully, is not purely triumphant. There is something more complicated there. The face of a man who understands now, more completely than he ever has, how fragile all of it is. How close the other story had been. How the photograph that exists is separated from the photograph that didn't by a defibrillator and a few seconds and the particular mercy of a morning that could have ended differently. Bronny James struggled in his rookie season. The weight of the name, the scrutiny of the cameras, the impossible standard of the comparison that everyone made and no one could avoid, it pressed on him in ways that even his father, who understood that pressure better than anyone alive, could not fully absorb on his behalf. LeBron watched from the bench, from the sideline, from the particular helplessness of a parent who knows that some lessons can only be learned by living them. He knows what that is like. He has been living it since he was 13 years old. In February 2025, LeBron James turned 40. The most durable player in the history of the NBA. A man who had played more minutes at a higher level for longer than anyone who had ever put on a uniform. But bodies are not impressed by records. They run their own arithmetic. And the knees and the ankles and the decades of accumulated contact were speaking now in a language that no training protocol could silence. He has spoken about retirement with an honesty that feels different from anything he has said before. Not the strategic ambiguity of a player managing his leverage. Something more human. More uncertain. More like a man standing at the edge of the only life he has ever known and trying to see what is on the other side. "I want to be present," he said in a conversation that circulated widely in the months after Bronny's cardiac arrest. "I want to be there. I don't want to miss it." It was the simplest thing he had ever said publicly. And it was the most revealing, because what LeBron James was describing, quietly, without drama, in a sentence that barely occupied a headline, was the thing that every version of his public life had been pushing against. The thing that the Chosen One title and the Chosen One responsibility had cost him across 40 years of being larger than life. The ordinary miracle of presence, of being in a room without the room knowing who you are, of watching your son live without the world watching you watch him. He gave the world everything it asked for. Multiple championships, unprecedented longevity, social activism that went beyond the court and into classrooms, into communities, into the I Promise school he opened in Akron in 2018. A public school for at-risk students that provides free tuition, meals, uniforms, and a safety net that looks remarkably like the one LeBron himself never had. Hundreds of children in his hometown. Children who look like the boy he used to be, given the thing he had to find for himself in fragments and accidents, and the grace of a football coach who saw something in the street. He built what he never had. And he built it publicly so that the people who needed to see it most could see it clearly. Before we reach the final reflection, one question. Of everything in this story, the boy sleeping in a stranger's house, the jersey burning in the streets, the morning his phone rang from a hospital, what stopped you? Tell us in the comments, because your answer says something important about what this story means to you. Here is what LeBron James's life reveals when you follow it past the trophies and past the controversies and past the mythology that his own genius helped construct. It reveals that the cost of being chosen is not paid once. It is paid continuously across every version of a life in the currency of privacy and spontaneity and the ordinary human right to fail without the failure being broadcast to 30 million people. It is paid in the inability to make a decision about your own career without it becoming a national conversation about loyalty and betrayal. It is paid in the specific loneliness of being the most recognizable person in every room you enter for every year of your adult life without a single pause. It reveals that the things he built, the championships, the foundation, the school in Akron, the empire, the father-son dream made real on an NBA court, are not the products of a man who had everything handed to him. They are the products of a boy who had almost nothing, who refused to accept the story that the world had written for him before he was old enough to read it, and who built something else, something larger, something that will outlast the game. And it reveals something about the morning in July 2023 that no championship can obscure and no achievement can answer. That LeBron James, for all the invincibility the world projected onto him, and that he at times projected onto himself, is a man, a father, a son, a person who grew up in a building without heat and became one of the most powerful athletes in history and still could not make his son's heart keep beating by sheer force of will. The Chosen One was not chosen for that. No one is. He has said, in the quietest moments of recent interviews, that the near loss of his son changed the way he hears the crowd. The roar that once told him he was real, that once filled the space inside him where home should have been, lands differently now. Not smaller, but less necessary. As if something that was once the center of gravity has shifted, and what remains at the center is something simpler. Two people on a court together. A father, a son, a game they both love, and the profound, unearned, irreplaceable gift of another morning. Gloria James raised a boy alone in a city the world had forgotten, and that boy became the greatest basketball player of his generation. He built a school for the children who are living the life he used to live. He brought a championship home to a city that had been waiting 52 years. He stood next to his son in an NBA uniform and felt the weight of every sleepless night and every eviction notice and every game played in a gym with no heat and no guarantee of tomorrow. And then he went to practice, because that is what you do when the game is still alive. You show up. You carry what you carry. You do the next thing. That is not a basketball lesson. That is the only lesson that has ever mattered. If LeBron's story moved something in you, the boy from Akron, the father in the hospital corridor, the man still showing up at 40, leave a like as a tribute to someone who gave more than the record books can hold. Subscribe so you never miss the stories that go past the statistics. And tell us in the comments, what is the one thing from this story, not from his career but from his life, that you will carry with you? Because the greatest thing LeBron James ever did was not a blocked shot in Game 7. It was not a championship trophy or a school in Akron or a billion-dollar empire built from a boy who had almost nothing. It was getting up, every time, from everything, and going back to work. That is the real record. And it has never been broken.